Guys, welcome back to Story Mode, the series in which I sit down with people from across the nerdy multiverse to talk about anything and everything about games or comics or whatever. Today I'm joined by comic book historian Alan Kistler. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. How are you, man?
It's cold. It's in Nebraska, it's snowing.
Oh, okay, sure. I'm in the dregs of Southern California right now, so it's a terrifying 73 degrees right now. It's
Oh,
yeah.
sounds bad.
Oh, it's terrible. No, it's what's great is I grew up on the East Coast, first in DC in the Maryland area, and then I was in New York for 15 years, so I'm used to much colder weather. And when it gets just a little bit chilly here, you'll see people like throw on scarves and cardigans, and I'm standing there in a t-shirt, maybe a shirt over it, and they just look at me like I have superpowers. Like, how are you? What is like? Why are you at an outdoor cafe? It's 69 degrees. What are you mad? Like, it's hysterical.
You're gonna catch the flu.
Yeah, exactly.
I was in my senior year of high school. We went to Washington D.C. and it was the same thing. Everybody's like it's like 60 something. Everybody's all bundled up with the whole Hoth-esque coat
Yeah.
covering their face. And you're like, what the heck's going on here? It gets cold. Like I don't know what it is about Nebraska, but it's just like it's November. It's gonna drop below zero.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I brought you in here, if you why don't you give yourself introduction to the people watching this, in case they don't know who you are.
Sure. So I was a entertainment journalist for a number of years, doing freelance work for MTV.com, Wired.com, Polygon. I still occasionally will do something for Polygon. I've got a column up at GeekGirlAuthority.com and some other websites. History Channel, I did a piece for them. But basically, over the years, I was less interested in just the basic journalism of things and less interested in just the top 5, top 10 lists. I mean, I've done a number of those for different sites like Comic Mix and Comics Alliance and Comic Book Resources. But my main interest was the history behind the scenes. And so over time, I became quickly known as a pop culture historian focusing on comic books and science fiction, or just as a comic book historian, depending on who you ask. Either one works. And I sometimes joke I'm really just a storyologist. I'm all about getting into the archaeology behind storytelling. And superhero comics and American sci-fi is really great for that because so much of it doesn't end. And so you get to really see the characters going through different eras in a way that, while there are different interpretations of Sherlock Holmes did end. Arthur Conan Doyle eventually stopped writing those books, and it was a while before anyone else picked it up. And usually people try to imitate him. Versus someone like Superman, where you can look at what is America hopeful of and afraid of in each era. Like he first shows up and he's fighting corrupt landlords and drug kingpins and people who beat their wives, which was insane that a 1938 comic book would even show spousal abuse, much less speak against it. And then you fast forward a few years, and his tagline, Truth and Justice, changes to Truth, Justice, and the American Way because World War II happened. And in the 50s, comic books are under attack for maybe being a promotion of anarchy or rebellion. And so suddenly, to survive, Superman has to become your dad. And he's just telling you to brush your teeth and don't worry about this. He's going to take care of Hercules having fallen out of a time rift. Just brush your teeth and, pay your taxes, please.
The world will go back to normal.
Right. And then the 60s, we turned up the sci-fi juice. Suddenly he's time traveling. He's fighting aliens because we're in the space race. And then the 70s, he starts going a little bit back towards the 1938 roots, and he's actually being introspective and saying, like, wow, I'm so powerful. If I help too much, am I just taking over? Am I a benevolent dictator? Doesn't humanity have to figure things out for themselves at times? Like, what is my purview? And a lot of that has continued on to today. There are great comics where he talks about if he helps in the Middle East, he has to be clandestine because there are political ramifications if certain people see a white American interfering with Middle Eastern affairs, and there can be retaliation and stuff like that. So that's one example, but that's the kind of stuff I delve into. And so I've written a number of articles on that. I lecture at classrooms sometimes and several cons. I'm at San Diego Comic-Con every year. with a few psychologist friends of mine, I have co-authored several essays in books such as Wonder Woman psychology, Doctor Who psychology, Star Trek psychology, Captain America versus Iron Man, freedom, security, and psychology, Walking Dead psychology. I appear in the special features of a few of the DC animated DVDs, so you can find me if you have the Blu-ray for Superman, Batman, Apocalypse, or if you've got Justice League New Frontier on DVD, or The Adventures of Plastic Man, the Aquaman '60s cartoon. I think I'm in Bad Blood and Batman and Son. And so I'm sort of all over the place here and there. I love Marvel and DC, but Marvel has yet to put me on any animated documentaries or any of that sort. So I tend to be associated with DC, which is fine. And I adore DC. I actually wrote DC Universe Now, the online service. They've been putting together sort of online encyclopedia entries for different characters, and I wrote some of those for them. So then likewise I consult sometimes on certain stories or cartoons or some of the folks who are tackling certain characters, and they might be curious about, has this been done with that character before, and how is the response? I will get a phone call or an email, and so there are a few stories that I've actually helped weigh in on and shape, which has been very exciting. And the past couple of years now, I still do this, but I'm now more about also putting out narratives myself. So I've been script doctoring a lot, helping people improve their stories. I have been writing stuff for some web shows, which are in production right now. One is called Just Super, which is a buddy comedy of these three women, and one of them gets powers, but really doesn't see why she needs to do anything, because she's a very Bridget Jones type, and she's like, well, why can't I just keep watching TV? And I'm also, for the past year and a half, I've been working for Bandai Namco on a couple of projects.
Okay. We'll talk about Young Justice then after we get off the air.
Oh, Greg's a pal. Greg Weisman, my boy. Oh. He was, after the show canceled, is really when he and I started becoming friends. And I would sometimes grill him, like, so what was going to happen in Young Justice Season 3? And he wouldn't tell me. I'm like, come on, Greg. Like, it's been 3 years now. I love you, but the show's not coming back. Just tell me what would happen in Season 3. And then, damn it, it's happening now. And I was like, okay, fine. You were right to keep that secret from me, Greg. Fine.
I was, you can ask my brother, like, as soon as I, like, read that, I was like, there's no way. And then, like, I started looking into it, and, like, just a thread of, like, it's happening. And then, like, Season 3, Young Justice.
Yeah.
Like, yep. I love that show. Oh.
So solid. So I'm still really surprised. Well, this is a tangent, but I'm still really surprised that when DC did the New 52 and decided they were going to reboot their characters, they did not take more notes from Young Justice, Justice League Unlimited, and the Teen Titans cartoon. Like, I really thought, like, those are now the versions that most people in the world know. Why wouldn't you take more notes from that? So that's very surprising to me.
Exactly. The New 52 is like when I actually started getting into comics, when I was
interesting.
them on a semi-regular basis, because, like, I was a high schooler. I was graduating in 2012, so didn't really have the money, but, like, that's when I started, like, buying the volumes and stuff. And I liked it, and I always kept up with comics. Wikipedia was amazing.
No, Wikipedia is helpful.
Read the stories that were going on, so that's how I kept up. But before that, it was just like, cool, this is my time to jump in. I was like, that's good. Superman went from pretty good to crap real quick, but
yeah.
And that made me sad. Like,
that made me real sad. But honestly, like, when you pick certain people to take over a certain book, I was like, no. Like, Scott Lobdell is someone you can put on certain stories, and he'll be fine.
Red Hood.
Don't put him on Superman.
Great.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Put him on Red Hood. He's fine. I actually really like what he does with Red Hood and the Outlaws. Superman, no.
The first, what was it, 3 issues of Superboy, I was like, okay, you know what? This is different. This is new.
Yeah.
I can understand that. And then it was just like the train went off the rails, and I was like, I'm so done.
And to be fair, like, to everyone involved in New 52, a lot of that was also editorials, throwing down edicts, changing those edicts. Like, it's not a coincidence that a lot of people rage quit their own books within the first 2 years of New 52, because it just got confusing and frustrating, especially when you're a writer and you're already being a writer or any kind of creative, when you're putting out a product, it is personal.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just business. You are mixing personal with business because you have to care about these stories and these characters to put out these stories. And so when someone agrees to your direction and you go a certain direction and then they say, you know what, I changed my mind. Actually, these last 3 issues should have been this issue. Rewrite them all this week. It's like
Superman.
It is not the same as, well, we need to redo these memos. Like it's a personal thing.
Yeah, because maybe that arc that you just wrote was setting up for something else you were planning later on, and now it's just like, oh, well, that's all trash now.
And
Good
also,
job.
those plans would have been told to editorial, so it's not like they didn't know. So there's a lot of that stuff. But it's funny you mentioned Wikipedia. That's part of what inspired me to start doing the stuff I do, because when I first started writing articles on the history of something, I was very strict to what happened in the comic and or explaining what is currently canonical versus what is an alternate timeline now or another Earth or whatever. And then Wikipedia and other things started showing up. And that's what I thought, I'm no longer necessary for just saying the strict history of this. So when I talk about the history of characters and going into them, I talk about like how I discuss Superman. Like, how does this reflect the society of the times? How does it reflect politics going on? How does it reflect social changes? What about certain writers and artists in particular? What experience of theirs did they bring into these stories? And also, like I said, with the psychology, like we discussed the mentality, the psychology lessons, and the morality of it. And that I find fantastic, because that'll separate an action movie that gets forgotten about in 2 years from like Die Hard. Like, there's something about John McClane we loved, and we needed to see him again. Unfortunately, we made too many sequels, and we lost.
I would say after the second one, too much. Like,
yeah,
there's only so many times he can escape that explosion when you're like,
yeah. No, Die Hard with a Vengeance was at least fun, and so I forgive it up for a lot of sins. Like, you know what, sure. And then after that, when we get to he's throwing motorcycles into helicopters and like running away from fighter jets.
My all-time favorite movie is Commando with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So I can forgive a lot of cheese.
Classic, yeah.
But at the same point in time, actually those two movies, speaking of Die Hard, are actually pretty much connected. But that's if that's a pretty geeky little nerdy history there. But yeah,
nice.
I love Commando's great. We need to get on topic though.
Sure.
As awesome as it would be to sit here and talk about 80s movies and all that, let's steer this back on track to video games, or let's talk about two worlds that I think you and I both know a lot about. I'm more of the history buff with video games.
Okay, great.
I assume you have some history buffness with video games, but I'd say more with comics.
Yeah, but it's for me much more with comics and American TV sci-fi, or even some British TV sci-fi. I mean, I wrote a whole book on the history of Doctor Who. But video games, yeah, I was into video games. Like, I came up in the 80s, so I by the time I arrived, video games were already a regular thing, but it was still relatively new. So Super Mario, the original Super Mario Brothers trilogy was. I still remember a friend's party when it turned out that friend for their birthday got Super Mario Brothers 3, and how exciting that was, and all of us gathering in his room and taking turns playing it and figuring out where was this warp whistle that we saw in the movie The Wizard, all that jazz. In high school and then college, I wasn't really into gaming much. I was involved in theater. I was involved in writing, and it just wasn't. I wasn't vibing on it. And then BioShock and Mass Effect. I saw friends of mine playing those, and immediately my attention was arrested, both because of the style of BioShock, the space opera-ness mixed with humor in Mass Effect, but also that in both of them, morality affected gameplay. And like I said, like, that's one of the things that I love about storytelling, discussing the morality or the mindset. What are we supposed to get from this? What's the theme? And,
did you go?
Yeah.
Oh, go on.
I was just going to say, like, and so I dove back into video games.
Did you go into then like Infamous by any chance?
Yeah, a little bit.
Those are some good games.
Yeah.
Sucker Punch did some really good work there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But okay, so with this podcast, what I want to do is I want to talk with you a little bit about the history of comic books and video games and where these two worlds kind of intersect. You see
Sure.
what I'm saying? And I think we got to start, well, as crappy and as bad as they might be considered today, I'm pretty sure they were okay when they first came out. I think we got to start in the Atari and 8-bit eras with like Superman. And then eventually I think there was a Spider-Man, and then Captain America had a game. But
Yeah, like, well, I think Spider-Man might have been first for Atari.
it might have been. It was either Superman or Spider-Man.
I'm pretty sure it was Spider-Man, and it was one of those things where they also, if you can find it on YouTube, they did a TV live action commercial with the Green Goblin threatening Spider-Man on a rooftop. Which, by the way, the Green Goblin in that commercial does not look bad. I'm actually kind of for that Green Goblin outfit. That looked pretty cool.
Yeah,
it looked accurate to the comics, more so than any movie has done. But it was. I mean, the thing is, in the 80s, and there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, the story is just a carrier for the tasks.
Mm-hmm.
There's no real thought about or care about the story. The story is told in a page in the little handbook just to tell you why there's a red thing moving across the screen and avoiding green things. Like, that's basically it. So they weren't thinking, how do we replicate the feeling of Spider-Man for our Atari users? Just like, okay, we'll make this red and blue thing because that's Spider-Man, and we'll make a green thing because that'll be the Goblin. And he climbs. Okay, so you have to climb a building and not fall. So go. And that was basically the game.
Mm-hmm.
It was just you climbed a thing. You really couldn't web swing around, and you just had to avoid these bombs and then get to the top of the roof and do a thing, and that would defeat the Green Goblin's bomb. And then you just kept doing that, and it got faster and faster.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really nothing. And Superman, likewise, it's like, okay, well, he can fly. So here's a blue thing that flies. Now here's just a less interesting version of Asteroid or a number of flight simulators.
Yeah, and I think like it was about the same from the 80s till the early 90s or late 90s if you want to get technical, where like superhero games along with mini games, if it was a character from television or a tie-in of any kind, it was okay, well, we'll just, I don't know, what's he do, CSI, okay, well, you're gonna go to a crime scene and try like investigate it. Good for you, go about your day.
Yeah, I mean it's funny looking at some of the video game tie-ins that seem to have nothing to do with the movies or take it into such a different place. Like, I remember the Goonies arcade game. I remember playing that in arcades and just thinking, where in the movie do you spelunk through this like cave of terrors? Like, there is a cave in Goonies, but it's not the same. Like, and just all this jazz.
Well, that even kind of carried on into like the early 2000s, and I guess maybe we should start there. But like, I got Spider-Man 2 before I went to go see the movie.
Right. Okay.
And I was like, so where's Mysterio?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, there were some in the 90s. We had some standout games. The 80s, we did not. The 80s, like, and I bought some of these games. Like, there was Spider-Man versus Mysterio.
Yep.
And I was like, all right, I love Mysterio. I love Spidey. This is gonna be great. And half the game was just crawling around an office building and avoiding like R2-D2s hiding in the cubicles. It's like, well, this is crap. It's like, you have to go through the special effects warehouse to find Mysterio. Like, really? Why can't I fight stuff? Or then there was the Captain America Spidey game where
Spider-Man and the X-Men, stuff
right,
like that.
It was so slow. But I mean, even the Spider-Man, by the time you got to Spider-Man and the X-Men, at least it got better. Like, I remember there was the X-Men game Arcade's Revenge, which, again, and it came with a mini comic, and it came with this like little Marvel handbook that was specifically about the X-Men characters involved. So you actually got very well versed in the basics of all these X-Men just with this game. And I was like, oh my god, this is exciting! Like, and then you play the game, and you had to pick one at a time, and you just go through an area where sometimes, like, oh, there's a key inside that box. How do we get it? And you become Nightcrawler, and you just bamf in, and okay, now you have the key. like, oh, there's a door here. How do you get it? And if you try to be Nightcrawler again, like, nope, it turned out that was a wall. Nightcrawler's dead. How do you get through the wall? And it was just this, there was no energy to it whatsoever. But then for me, what started changing things was Spider-Man versus Kingpin, which was like 1990. And that was the first time I can remember really feeling like, oh, they like the comic. Because not only was it just better in terms of action, like you had web swinging, you had punching, it felt more like a fighting game like Street Fighter or like Streets of Rage and all that jazz. Like you could actually punch things. But on top of that, you would get points by taking photos of yourself in action.
Yeah.
And that was so cool to me that they had integrated that aspect of Spider-Man's life, that he had to pay for the web chemicals by selling photographs. So that was really cool. And then the X-Men arcade game was just fun. It was just fun.
Yeah.
I loved the double screen. We were with friends, and you would have 4 friends or play with 4 strangers, and you just start enjoying yourselves and trash talking each other, maybe even 5 strangers. And it was way great. It was a way fun method of introducing you to some of the characters like White Queen and the Sentinels and the Mandroids. Dazzler. I mean, Dazzler and Nightcrawler became like my favorite X-Men across comics. And the first time I got to play them in that game, I was like, oh my God, this is exactly how I've always wanted to play them, where they're kicking
and the music.
ass. The music was so 80s and synthesized and great. It was fantastic. But yeah, then it started falling off because then they didn't repeat that. You had games like Spider-Man and the X-Men, which was okay, but not the same energy. And then you had other games where, like, I mean, Spider-Man 1 was pretty crap, based on the first movie.
Oh God,
Like,
that one. It's just
crap.
a reskin of the first one. You know that? It started off, it was going to be an HD remake of Spider-Man of Neversoft. It's just like, oh yeah, this totally shows.
And meanwhile, DC couldn't get a decent game to save their lives, the DC characters, because you had all these Batman games based on the movies, which were not great. The movies were fine, but I mean, the games were not great.
The original Batman, 89 Batman, that game, not horrible.
Not horrible, but it's not something you got excited about. Like, oh my God, I got to play Batman. No, you would rather, after a while, just rewatch the movie.
Yeah.
Same thing with like the Rocketeer. I mean, I had that game, and the early stages were challenging and kind of fun, but then it's like, you know what? I just want to fly, and half the time I can't freaking fly because
you're out of gas.
I'm out of gas. Like I need to collect more gasoline on this level. Like that's not a terribly interesting problem to solve. And then Superman had that horrible Superman 64 game.
Hey, listen.
Yeah.
I was 10.
Yeah.
I was 10, and that was like, my mom's like, what do you want for your birthday? I'm like, I want Superman 64.
Right.
Like, that's one of those things. If I could get in a time machine, I'd be like, no, you don't.
Yeah, no, you're just going to be flying through loops a bunch.
But I finished it. I finished it because
that's remarkable. That's remarkable because I did not. I got fed up. I mean, the coolest DC characters game from that time, from the 90s, I can think of, is the Justice League fighting game, Justice League Task Force, which was just Street Fighter with a bunch of DC characters. And that was kind of fun.
Well, what was it? Like, the 90s is an interesting time, especially if, like, for both the comics industry and the video games industry, because in the 90s you have Sega versus Nintendo, which eventually gave us Sony, and then gave us PlayStation, and 3D gaming started to become the norm. And then in the comics, you had the big comic boom, the death of Superman, and like this is also interesting because you get to the point where you have like what was it? There was Maximum Carnage. And then there was the Death and Return of Superman, like these tie-in video games to comic book events. Yeah,
and it was interesting. Like Maximum Carnage, a lot of people are down on it. I mean, and to be fair, it was a ridiculous story to begin with. It was a 14-part story that half of it was just, Carnage is killing a lot of people. What do we do? And it was just running around and not really... Also, I mean, in general, I find Carnage to be actually like a very shallow character.
Wait. You're telling me a character made in the 90s is not full of depth?
I know. I'm like, everything about this character is so like, let's just give him a name that is just a bad thing. Carnage. like that it kept happening in the '90s. Even Venom, like they had to keep
Mhm.
tripping over themselves. Like, why would he call himself Venom? Oh, I don't know. It was the '90s. Like, oh, well, we need a new explanation. But for its flaws, like what I really dug about when I was a kid playing Maximum Carnage was that again there was some idea of the characters and story, because if you played as Venom, you were very strong and resistant to injury,
Mhm.
but you were slow. And if you played as Spidey, not as strong, not as resistant, but so much more agile, so faster. And even those little touches I appreciated as a comic book fan. And that's the thing, because as we keep saying, like the games that didn't hit with us were games that really didn't consider what do the fans like about these characters,
Mhm.
that we can also translate to new people and make them fans of the characters. Like Spider-Man versus Kingpin did that. If you had never read a Spider-Man comic, you would get so many basics about Spider-Man through that video game, and what kind of stuff Spider-Man deals with. That he's a photographer and a superhero, and he's got to balance that. It can't just be ignoring one life for the other. Uh, the X-Men arcade game, like all the enemies, in as ridiculous as the game was, and while it didn't have a lot of like story arc to it, it still did a great job of introducing what are the threats the X-Men face. They face racists with too much technology. They face mutant terrorists, like,
Mhm.
and they face people that they have deep connections to, like Mystique being Nightcrawler's mom, stuff like that. And then X-Men and Spider-Man team up. It was okay, but it was purely an action game, and so we look back at it like, oh yeah, that game, cool. No one's really begging for it to come back in like a re-release or for there to be an emulator. It was just this game where you played as one of them, and then some of them were just downright crap, like the Wolverine game
Yeah.
where you couldn't use his claws without costing your powers or something, and it's like you took
Wasn't
away the coolest thing about Wolverine to a lot of
wasn't it
kids.
health? Like you die eventually if you use them
Right.
too much.
Right, exactly. Which is like negates everything about Wolverine that you know.
Yeah.
Um,
Wolverine, he's the guy that just walks around with his fists like this, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's again like you just took another game and just slapped Wolverine on it. And even as a kid, you can tell that.
Yeah.
So it's that I think that was the secret sauce that wasn't repeated enough, especially in the '90s when the economy wasn't terrible, and you had a lot of people, and comics were doing it too, just throwing things at the wall to get that consumer market, because the '80s had done something very interesting with cartoons,
Mhm.
and the '80s had proved, oh my god, kids will have loyalty to this toy of a truck that turns into a robot if we give them a cartoon that makes them care about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got to keep doing stuff like that. And then, of course, like any marketing does, after a while, you oversaturate it. You just rush products and you don't think about that story and that narrative in the first place being the reason people came to it. But Spider-Man 2, like you mentioned, like that was actually that again, like tried to approach Spider-Man as what is it that people like about Spider-Man. And one of those was just web swinging.
Yeah. That's where I was gonna get next is like Spider-Man 2 was just a shift in how games in general were produced, you know? I think
Yeah,
wasn't it like a year or before that was Grand Theft Auto 3,
right.
and that was the, big open world. You had Super Mario 64 before that, Ocarina of Time in 98. Games were going 3D, open world.
Yeah,
And then when Activision got the rights to make games based on the Spider-Man franchise, it was just natural to think, well, we need an open world New York. And I think a lot of people have like to look back at the web swinging and Spider-Man 2 and be like, oh, it's so good. It's just like the nostalgia goggles are in full
yeah,
effect here. And
sure.
like I went back to play it before this new recent Spider-Man game came out. I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But I'm like, this is crap. Like this is something special here.
Well,
you
also the
know.
side quests would be things like this child lost her balloon.
My
Find it.
balloon.
Yeah, find it.
Yeah, and
Like
you can't use your webs because apparently Spider-Man now has daggers in the webs, and
yeah, like oh, the web will be too strong to get the balloon. Like you must cradle it
yeah, you
like a
must
kitten.
jump in the sky. Oh well,
Yeah,
it got up too high. Now you gotta go deal with her crying.
yeah,
But
yeah.
like, it was
But
cool. It was interesting.
it was new partly because what it did was By the same token, you could say, oh, but having Wolverine suffer from his claws is new. Yes, but it didn't serve the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And didn't give us that was a new thing that limited us. It was saying you can't use the claws all the time. Whereas giving an open world for someone like Spider-Man, whose character really emphasizes freedom. Like that's the thing. Like the ability he has to swing across this concrete and steel canyon that is New York City is a very freeing thing. Not very different from Superman's flight or the Flash's speed. It is about movement and grace and freedom. He's sort of not exactly defying gravity, but sort of giving it the finger as he's leaping 40 feet in the air at some of the comics clock him at about 40 miles an hour when he's going top speed web swing. Like it's this incredible thing. And the fact that you could emulate that at all, much less for the first time in a game, was exciting. It's a new thing of like just I can take Spider-Man on a ride. And also while we had levels you could revisit or explore a little bit, like Legend of Zelda, like the first Metroid, the whole idea of the open world 3D environment was just so exciting. And again, it was not just new, but it made you think about the possibilities that could be explored now, and how this could be the first bit of something else you build on, and what could come next.
Yeah, and I think you saw that a year later, where Activision actually put more money behind it, and they created, I think, the game that you can credit, as to giving Warner Brothers the green light for Arkham Asylum later on, Ultimate Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Where it was like, okay, this isn't based on a movie. This is kind of based on the comics. You got Brian Michael Bendis. You got, gosh darn, I can't remember the artist's name.
Mark Bagley?
Yep, Mark Bagley there. And, they're working with Activision to make sure this feels right. And I guess it kind of tied in the comics, but it was also like a side story. But, that was a game that wasn't like based on anything. That was its own story and all that. And it was great. And that led us into, like, once again, another Spider-Man game. I feel like, like, what is it with usually the most successful superhero games are either Spider-Man, Batman. I guess you give it to Superman, but that's even iffy.
Superman really hasn't had a successful game. Like, not a real...
Not, like, critically.
Yeah, exactly. Like
they've sold well.
Which is a shame. I think there's a lot of potential, especially with the technology we have now. I think there's so much potential for some great Superman games. But now it's a problem also of you've got to sell people on it, because they'll immediately point to, like someone in a room would point to, but Superman 64 didn't do well. And telling them, but that was 30 years ago, is really not going to like convince them.
Yeah, they're still going to be like, well, look at that. Like, we tried that.
Yeah. I mean, this happens in films too. Like you had for years people saying, that one of the reasons you didn't want to give one of the female superheroes a try at a movie because Elektra and Catwoman did badly. So superhero women aren't popular. And you try to tell them, but one, that was a decade ago, and two, those were bad movies. It wasn't that they were good movies and no one was interested. They were bad movies.
Yeah, no one cared.
Yeah, but they're just looking at the numbers. And I think that's affected, that's affected why we haven't seen another attempt at a Super Mario Brothers movie. Because if you think about it, like Pixar or like some kind of style like that, like a Big Hero 6 or something, could rock out a Super Mario Brothers movie. But Nintendo's still gun shy after that terrible live action thing.
Isn't there a... Who makes Minions? Despicable Me Minions. They're making the new Grinch. I think they have a deal with Nintendo to make a movie.
Right. So we might see something developed along the lines later on. And
but you're not wrong. It's been what, 20 years since then?
Yeah. The fact that there isn't a Mega Man animated movie in the style of like Big Hero 6, like
there has been a Mega Man series. It's airing on Cartoon Network right now.
Right. No, I've seen. Crap. I mean, there's this series. They keep doing TV series, but I mean like a true rock on movie.
Mm-hmm.
Like the fact that they haven't done that is insane. The fact that we haven't had like a fun Lord of the Rings style Legend of Zelda movie already, especially with the different timelines, you can absolutely do something and call it canon or not. It'll work. But Yeah, there's a gun shyness because of how many how many video game based movies were bad.
Oh yeah. Well, that brings us to a different, conversation where it's like, is it because, well, are they bad because it's just hard to translate, or is it bad because like, you get so used to having the experience through the controller in your hand and not watching it?
It's the same thing with why are so many comic book video games bad? Is it bad because it is hard to translate the narrative to a video game or something? And the fact is, like, any adaptation is hard.
Mm-hmm.
You either rise up to the challenge or you don't, and you ask yourself, like, what are you actually bringing? And also, you have to bring in the right people.
Mm-hmm.
Honest Trailers just did a great video about Batman the Animated Series,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the things they brought up was sort of jokingly criticizing the Zack Snyder DC films, saying, "Why can't you be like Batman the Animated Series, where you bring on a collection of really great and talented people who happen to be the right people for the job, who all happen to have good ideas, who happen to also be very familiar with the best parts of Batman, who also happen to be doing a show in the cultural zeitgeist of the time that really speaks to fans, while balancing all these things that shouldn't have worked in balance but did." As like, yeah, when you think about it, that show should not have worked on some of those levels.
Mm-hmm.
Half of it was a great accident of timing and exactly the right people coming together who were not just wanting to do a good show, but willing to take it in different directions than were expected. And that's tough to do. That's tough to replicate. And it's certainly tough to do with any adaptation. I mean, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein still remains one of the best science fiction horror novels.
Mm-hmm.
How many bad Frankenstein movies have we seen?
A lot.
Yeah, yeah. Like I Frankenstein. Like I remember the tagline. Like
My mom
100
loves
years.
that movie.
I just remember the tagline of the poster made me angry because it was like 200 years later, he's still alive. Well, of course he would be. He's your protagonist.
Yeah, and
Like,
he's undead.
Yeah, like what are you talking about? Like that's your big selling point? He's still alive. Well, I would hope so, or it's a real short movie.
Yeah, and where's the Frankenstein? There he is, dead. Okay.
Yeah.
Credits.
Exactly. Like,
$13 wasted.
So with comic books, it is a matter of getting the people on. Like, are you there? Are you looking at the story as a carrier? Are you looking at the comic book stuff as a carrier for just a game you want to put out? Or are you looking at what is in this comic book that we can turn interactive?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, which is not always easy to figure out, but you've got to start with that foundation.
Well, speaking of Batman the Animated Series and, interpretations and bringing people together, let's get into, I think, the game that has basically changed how any superhero game is going to be made from now on, Arkham Asylum.
Yeah.
Batman.
That was nuts when it came out.
Oh, I love that game. Still to this day. But it's like the story behind it's even interesting, like you have Warner Brothers trying to make a Dark Knight game, and I think Pandemic was in charge of making it. That fell through because of something or other. And then they tried to be like, hey, Rocksteady, why don't you make a Batman game? And I guess somewhere through the process, they're like, this isn't working. And they said, just do, carte blanche, do what you want. And then you get, and they came together and they created this story. And isn't it based off of some Grant Morrison comic?
Very loosely. The concept is the same.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else is pretty different. The Grant Morrison and Dave McKean, who is very well known for doing the covers to Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, wonderful artist. The two of them did a graphic novel in the late 80s called Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And in it, the Joker basically takes over the asylum and says, hey, Batman, like, come on in and you can save the hostages if you just sort of, run our gauntlet. And so Batman enters the asylum, and it's a very cerebral story. It kept having flashbacks to Jeremiah Arkham, or Amadeus Arkham, rather, the original founder, who had imprisoned at one point or incarcerated his family's killer, and then eventually goes mad himself. And so you were seeing these flashbacks of the madness that had his family. And so there's the part of that story was the implication of, is this asylum sort of damned by the spirit of who created it? Is his madness almost like infecting the ground beneath it? And then the other aspect to it that was very interesting was as Batman's going through this gauntlet, there's a lot of religious imagery, there's a lot of mythic imagery, and a small implication that, well, not an implication, but rather just this using for symbolism, having each of the asylum inmates Batman encounters there reflect some part of his own personality. And so you could look at it metaphorically that Arkham Asylum is the house of Batman's mind, and these are all these different demons who want him to go too far one way or another, and he's constantly not. He keeps sane, and he looks into that madness, but he doesn't become part of it. And it also had some really great interpretations of certain villains, that like Maxie Zeus, and it had a new idea for the Joker, which Grant Morrison then repeated in different comics of his. And Scott Snyder has touched on this a little bit in his Batman comics, which was that there are comic book writers who like to ignore certain parts of continuity, and certainly comic book editors. This is why DC, to smaller degrees Marvel, but Marvel does it too, has reboots of continuity and reality, where, oh, well, forget the Joker of the 50s and the 60s. That was a silly version of the Joker. So just, we're only paying attention to the Joker starting from 1975 on, because that's when he's a vicious killer. And And we don't know how to marry that idea with the goofy Joker of the 40s and 50s, who was stealing paintings based on comedians and stuff. Grant Morrison, what he loves to do in so many of his stories is say, no, all of it happened. We just have to reinterpret how it happened or why it happened. And so in Arkham Asylum, a serious house on serious earth, it is referenced that the Joker has at times been not homicidal and more of the Romero Joker from the Adam West era, where he's sort of a prankster and stuff. And the psychologist mentions that in her mind, the Joker reinvents himself from time to time. And this is part of the chaos of his personality. And that he might be doing it in reaction to certain things around him. He might be doing it in reaction to changes in Batman's life. Did he start becoming a clown after Batman took on his first sidekick and started hanging out with friends, i.e. the Justice League? Only to then later decide, well, now the stakes need to be high again, and so he shifted back to killer. Or is it possible that whatever chemicals warped his skin and his hair color also affected his brain, and he essentially is taking in too much sensory information? And so he guides himself by cutting off into certain paths of his and choosing, this is who I am now. And Grant has approached that idea time and time again. It was great. There was also a great scene, one of my favorite tragic Two-Face scenes, where the psychologists there are trying to wean Two-Face off his coin. And so they're like, well, the world isn't just a binary choice. And so they move him on to a pair of dice and then playing cards. And unfortunately, while they introduce him to the idea that, look, there are 52 combinations of what you can do, and then like start putting it into the even the tarot eventually, where there's even more combinations and meanings, it also meant now that he couldn't go to the bathroom without consulting the cards first. And by the time he would get an answer, he'd already gone in his pants and stuff. And Batman was like, one of the reasons I love the story is, while it's dark as hell and a mind trip, it is also repeatedly reminding you about Batman's compassion, which is something that some adaptations and a few writers forget sometimes. And Batman has to have compassion, or else he would be just killing criminals instead of taking them to prison or an asylum. We repeatedly see in the stories he wants people to reform. He hopes they get better. He hopes Harvey gets better. He doesn't want Dick to be like him. He doesn't want Tim and Jason and Damien to be like him. He wants them to be better and more heroic and not fall into the darkness that has infected him partly. And in that story, you see he has this great compassion and is very judgmental of the psychologist. Like, are you actually helping Harvey, or are you just worsening his condition? You know, are you just experimenting on him? Like once you saw this consequence, why didn't you stop? Like, why are you still continuing with this form of therapy? And in the end, like, gives him his coin back, because, like, yeah, this means I have to fight Two-Face again, but at least he's not helpless and like this pitiful man-child. So yeah, it's this incredible story, and I definitely recommend folks read it. And then the video game just took sort of that basic premise and went in its own path, obviously, because they needed to make a video game, and so they made it a very different, wider spanning story. They also placed it in a different version of Arkham that by that point had been developed, where Arkham's on more of an island, and as had been established in the comics, and in this case was this multi-building facility and all that jazz, and had been also slightly reformed to have prisoners in there as well from Blackgate, and it turns out the Joker arranged that. But aside from the premise, the other link that it has to the graphic novel is that if you are a gamer who's into side quests and such, if you're looking around and keep finding those artifacts that tell you the story of Amadeus Arkham, you are piecing together the same origin story that Grant Morrison conceived and wrote for the original graphic novel.
Yeah, and that's what I think is the best part about that game, because, like, even take out Grant Morrison and the whole, like, you know, Arkham side story, you get into the Riddler trophies, you get into the Riddler's riddles when, you know, you got to scan certain objects, and you get like Quincy Shark hints towards Killer Croc, and then you get into like the tapes and all that. And it was
the tapes are great.
Yeah. Oh, they're fantastic.
Yeah, the psychology tapes where you're actually hearing therapy sessions with the Joker, with the Scarecrow, with like that. See, again, that shows a care, because that has nothing to do with the immediate game, with the exception of one of them. But it's all just there
to build this world.
To build this world, to get you into this world. If you have never read a Batman comic before, oh man, you know the world pretty damn well by the time you finish that game. And you have a sense, not just Scarecrow first appeared here, and this is what he does, and this is who he is, but how does Scarecrow think? What drives him? What entertains him? And that's part of what makes that game fantastic.
And then you get into the sequels of it, though. I think Arkham City is great. Arkham Knight, I think, is where it kind of dips.
Arkham Knights is very frustrating to me because, well, like, so Arkham City, the premise is a little bit more ridiculous. It sort of dips into that no man's land story from Batman, where Gotham just got so screwed up and ravaged by an earthquake that certain supervillains then pushed Congress and manipulated Congress to basically say, you know what, screw Gotham, we're not rebuilding it. We're blowing up the bridges and abandoning it. And so Gotham for a year was left on its own, and it was gang warfare and stuff. And it's like, it's such a ridiculous premise, not only if you consider, but people like Superman and the Justice League exist, but that the government would totally give up on us. Once, if there are still people there, that they would prevent those people from leaving. Like, abandoning a city, fine, maybe, but just leaving the people there and saying, no, you can't even use the bridge, screw you. It's like, what?
Lost cause.
Yeah, this is like, you know, in the Blade Runner world that could work. In something where you're trying to make it resemble the modern world we live in, we're not quite that far gone. So Arkham City, the idea being that the worst part of Gotham City has now been converted into a big prison yard, is fairly ridiculous, but it's a fun game. It's a fun game. It's got a fun open world aspect to it. I like the side quests with Zaz and some of the others. I like that you could get to play some levels as Catwoman. Actually, the only things that I really criticized about that game was I thought the ending could use a little work. I don't think in storytelling in general, I'm not always a fan of twists that seem to be there for the sake of being twists.
Mm-hmm.
And
you can go ahead and spoil it if you want. I mean, it's
just some of the villains involved and stuff. Like it just like oh well, it turned out this was Ra's al Ghul the whole time, or like and this other thing. Like, but does that really add anything to this narrative? Like, it's if you have a twist, like give me some emotional stuff behind it. Some of the side quests I wish were stronger.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a fun open world.
The best one I loved, and this was what kind of made me sour on Arkham Knight a little bit, but the best one, and that was, I think, the best, and that I can say the best anymore, but Hush was great. The one with Hush, oh, that was a good build-up.
I like that build-up. I was just as disappointed that once you confront the villain Hush, he then just kind of leaves.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, bye now. It's like, well, wait, don't I get something here? Like maybe they should have made that a DLC and like had a battle or something.
I always thought that they were going to do something in the next one.
See, that's the thing. That's the thing. Like, well, it's like you also have a side quest with Azrael, which was really cool, but again was sort of this implication of we will come back to this, and then they don't, and so there are these hanging threads. Which I keep thinking, like, well, honestly, guys, like, even if you didn't know, though, that the third game wouldn't do this, I also get suspicious of games that have too many hanging threads. Just like I get suspicious of too many movies, like The Amazing Spider-Man 2.
Mm-hmm.
Half that movie is just to tell you there'll be other movies later. And in fact, there weren't any. But even if there weren't, you weaken that movie by doing that repeatedly. Like, oh, the cool stuff comes later. No, you got to give me some cool stuff here. You can hint at one or two things. Don't hint at so much. But I mean, Arkham City is still fun. Like the only other thing is, I actually talked with Grant about this a while back, where because of how big Arkham City is, because they decided to make the entire open world that's open to you this city that's been converted into a prison, as opposed to, hey, these 5 blocks are the prison, and then the rest of this is just Gotham City.
Mm-hmm.
You just look at like, wait, they were willing to abandon how much of the city to just be a prison, and also the water is green at times, and it's just like, and Grant was sort of joking, it just sort of looks like hell. Like if Gotham is this damned, what is Batman doing? And it's just one of those things that you sort of, it doesn't ruin the game for me by any stretch, but it's something that I'm very aware of, and I just sort of suspend my disbelief and chuckle at.
Well, I think that's at a certain point you got to think here, like, why would you live in Gotham at a certain point,
Well, this is again how you get into how certain writers depict it, and how certain because there are writers who, like Batman animated series, show that Gotham has a lot of crime, absolutely, but they also show there are lots of good people working to improve it, and also they show that it is noticeably improved since years before, and you see like people rebuilding communities. Like in the 90s and 80s, Alan Grant, one of the big Batman writers at the time, would not just show Batman fighting as Bruce Wayne, but would not just show Batman fighting crime, but also showed Bruce Wayne going to schools and offering scholarships and helping clean up the inner city neighborhoods and reaching out through philanthropy, because he wanted to truly improve Gotham, and knew you don't just do that through violence. You have to improve the infrastructure. You have to inspire the community. But then you have some Batman writers and editors who will argue there should be no hope in Gotham. This should look like, a mad architect built it as a home for gargoyles and demons, and like deliberately put in as many dark alleys as he could so that it would be easier for later generations to mug people. Like, and so you've got these two sort of warring ideas, and I think that Hell on Earth idea can work as the starting point. But if in the timeline Batman's old enough now that Dick is Nightwing and Tim is Robin, as happened in Arkham City, there's got to be some blocks that are fine. There's got to be some blocks that are fine. There's got to be, like, criminals have to have some general fear. It can't truly be overrun with just evil. Because you know what? Then Gordon's not staying. Then Tim's not staying. half the population is just going to leave, and it will just become a ghost town.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like I said, I enjoyed Arkham City, but like you, Arkham Knight, oh man.
Well, I wonder how much of Arkham Knight's problems come from it wasn't written by Paul Dini. Like, he was not involved with Arkham Knight like he was with Arkham Asylum and Arkham City. Because if you play those two games, he's definitely setting up for something.
Yeah.
And then one of those like, nope, we don't have, we don't do. What was it? They did some policy and said, nope, can't write it. And then I guess they brought some other guy in, and oof. Like, when you get over halfway through the game and you see Scarecrow and you're like, oh yeah, that was the main villain,
right?
You got a problem.
There's Arkham Knight, and what frustrates me, it has some elements. See, if it was all bad, I could dismiss it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not all bad, which is what's frustrating. There's some good stuff in there. There's like the subplot that Batman is now hallucinating the Joker as sort of his sidekick / Jiminy Cricket is pretty brilliant. And some of Mark Hamill's best performances as the Joker are in that subplot. It's great. But you keep having all these threads that don't really do anything. You severely weaken Poison Ivy and her power and agency. You also, like, you do this whole bait and switch where it looks like you've killed Barbara rather viciously, and then it turns out, oh, she's not dead. Like, okay, you know what? Between doing that and having basically a flashback to the Killing Joke, like, you're just sort of being mean at this point. Like, there's nothing shocking about this. It's just cruel. And it didn't add to the story. It's just Barbara, you don't hear about her for a while. And also, we sort of did that, oh, are they really dead play in a much more effective scene in Arkham Asylum with the Scarecrow and Jim Gordon. There was a lot of there that just seemed to be there for flash or shock value. The Batmobile does not really work.
What do you mean? The guy that doesn't use guns can't have a 50 cal tank?
Yeah, anytime anyone tries to make, like, Batman Begins, I let them get away with it because of the style of that movie and because of how they used it in the first movie. But other than that, anyone who tries to give Batman a tank as opposed to a car, I'm just like, I think you really missed the point of this. And also, it has to be functional. A tank will not drive through the streets of Gotham in any chase. Like, nor is, like, Batman announcing his presence this much. Like, I remember Sam Witwer, who was perfect for this because he plays Darth Maul in the Star Wars cartoons, and he also played Doomsday in Smallville.
Don't bring up Smallville Doomsday.
Smallville is a mixed bag, but I thought like it's again like how they showed the creature. Wasn't thrilled by, but the idea of there being a human identity I actually thought was really cool and interesting and gave Doomsday some depth. But either way, he was playing Arkham Knight, and he tweeted one night about, like, man, driving this Batmobile around, and Man of Steel had just come out, and so he's driving the Batmobile around. It's like, man, driving this Batmobile around in Arkham Knight, I'm accidentally killing so many people. I feel like Superman. And I was like, oh my God. Trash talk from Doomsday about Man of Steel.
Yeah.
But yeah, Arkham Knight. Also, the ending. I'm not into endings that are just like weird for the sake of being weird. Like, it's like, oh, well, it's supposed to symbolize. No, it symbolizes nothing. They just thought this would be a cool thing to make people wonder what it symbolizes, and that's not genuine.
They didn't give anything behind. Like, it would have been different if it was like, okay, here's the ending, and then there's DLC that expands upon it. But then, the DLC is just crap.
and it's just it didn't have anything interesting to say about Batman, really. And you could have expanded it so much more. You could have, the way that Arkham City had these DLCs where you play as Robin and Nightwing, which was okay. I wish they would have been integrated into the game. By Arkham Knight, you should have integrated them into the game. Holy crap.
Yeah, it was like in Arkham Knight, it was very much, okay, we need to have a reason to have Nightwing come up, so we can be like, oh, there's Nightwing, but then have a reason where Batman's like, no, you can't help me. I'm all alone. I'm all alone in my city. And
Which at a certain point is actually antithetical to Batman. Batman is fine with working with agents and with working with teammates to a certain degree. He wants to be in charge.
Yeah,
but
especially Dick Grayson.
especially Dick Grayson at this point in his life, where Dick's been Nightwing for a while. Like, no, get the hell over yourself.
Yeah,
it's there's a lot of frustration there. It's I actually have less frustration with Arkham Origins.
Yeah, not that bad.
Not that bad. I think Arkham Origins' biggest problem to me is that it didn't feel safe not having the Joker be the main villain. To the point where you're fighting Black Mask for a while, and I thought that was cool. And then it turns out, oh, Black Mask has been in prison. It's been the Joker the whole time. Like, well, that means nothing. Like, that doesn't make me go back in the earlier game like, oh, so I see that this meant this and this. No, it doesn't. It's just, it was Black Mask and then it wasn't. That's not really exciting. And
it also suffers the filler problem like anime does, when they want to give like the manga time to get ahead, so they go up and they make their own saves, but all the toys have to go back in the toy box before after its end, so it's like you can't really do anything.
Yeah, it's I mean, you could have explored it in different ways. You could have used some other villains that don't show up in Asylum, and so you or even also other characters that don't show up in Asylum, and so you can imply there's a dangerous stake here, or even if you just use it to give some insight into them. Like, I actually really liked the scenes with the Joker, where he's trying to size Batman up, and is really trying to figure out what this means. And although it meant they really rushed the Harley Quinn origin, I did sort of like that they had an aside where the Joker, you're playing as him through his delusions, as he's trying to explain what Batman means to him. Like, that was great. And again, so that's again why I still prefer Arkham Origins, because at least I can enjoy, you were trying to say something about these characters. And you weren't just like, this is how they first met. You wanted to explore why, when they first met, did the Joker become interested in this guy? Did the Joker start seeing him as my opposite number? You tried to answer that question, and I respect that. Arkham Knight just tried to say, how dark can we get this? And that's not a terribly interesting question to me. Not unless the darkness is to prove a theme, or for Batman to then be the light against the darkness. Like, then you have storytelling. If it's just, let's get as dark as possible. Guys, we're already in Gotham. Chill out.
Yeah, it's not like it's like Metropolis or something when you wanted to have it go dark and, Superman's the hope. But,
Yeah. But nonetheless, that series of games has changed how we think about superhero games. And now anytime someone brings up, they should do a game on this character, they bring up, I would love to see an Arkham Asylum game about Superman. I would love to see an Arkham Asylum game with Wolverine, because we've been talking about the story, how much it brought about the story, but also the gameplay.
Yeah, they changed everything.
No, the gameplay was like the first time you felt like this is what it's like to fight as Batman. And also how much of it involved detective work of using his technology, scanning for clues, scanning for fingerprints, looking for this trail. That is, and stealth. How much of this involves stealth, which is Batman's key? Half of those levels were not, I must descend and kill all and like take all these people down. It was, I have to freak these people out, or I have to scare them.
When you scare the crap out of that last guy.
Yeah. Like, it's
awesome.
That's great, because again, that's getting into what Batman does as a character, and part of why we like him. That he's not invincible, and so what he figures out is, how do I scare people into not being able to fight me? Or how do I use stealth and ninja tactics to take down 10 people in a locked room? And that's the stuff that we still talk about and really affected us, and which is now carrying over into the new Spider-Man game.
Yep, that's where I was going.
Yeah.
Have you finished it?
I'm aware of the ending. I haven't finished myself, but I have seen the ending.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to spoil it, but goddamn.
Yeah.
That game is great. Insomniac, but it is very much Spider-Man, it's Arkham Asylum.
Yeah, and it's, but at the same time, it's not doing what a lot of 80s and 90s games did, where it just copied what the other game was and stamped their character on it. The idea of the gameplay where you're doing all these flips and agility and able to like the AI figures out after you punch that guy, you're probably going to want to punch the next guy. That is all Arkham Asylum. But then the style of moves, the style of stealth, the weapon choices, and again, how he operates and the personality involved. It's all Spider-Man. And again, just as Paul Dini was such a huge part of what made Arkham Asylum and Arkham City fun, Dan Slott, who's a pal, was writing Spider-Man for I think like 8 years. And like he worked on one of the previous Spider-Man games, Shattered Dimensions, which while the gameplay at times wasn't as smooth as I would have liked, I enjoyed the hell out of that narrative. And so you bring this dude who was not just a huge fan of Spider-Man since childhood, but lives, breathes, and eats it, and has been writing Spider-Man for years in the comics. You had him involved in the storytelling. Well, yeah, that's a great decision, guys. That's a great behind-the-scenes decision. That's the kind of stuff that leads to this kind of a game. And then you have Yuri Lowenthal, an acquaintance of mine. Yuri, huge comic book fan. Huge, excited. He's played Superman and Spider-Man now, and he loves it. He plays Superman on the cartoon Legion of Superheroes.
Oh yeah,
yeah, that's Yuri.
Yeah, Ben 10, wasn't he?
I believe so. I forget on Ben 10. I'm not as familiar with the Ben 10 stuff, but yeah, Yuri is my boy, and him doing Spider-Man like that. That's a pitch perfect Peter Parker right there. Like the performance. And then again, another thing that game added when I heard about it, and I thought, okay, again, now you've got me because you care and you thought about this, and this has no reason to be there other than it would make sense for Spider-Man, and we thought it would be cool. The fact that the voice performance changes, whether Spider-Man is standing or swinging, that's fantastic. That you could be hearing something and Spider-Man could say, "Sure, I'll look into that right now." Or you could have that scene and have him swinging, and you'll hear, "Sure, I'll look into that right now." Like it just that they would take the time. And I've worked in video games. I've been in VO booths. It's a lot of time and effort. It's a lot of person power you're putting into things. That you would take the time to do multiple performances of just the in between cutscene stuff because you want the computer to have an option of, the player is swinging on a web now, change it to version B5.
Well, I think like another good decision they made is they aged Spider-Man up. It wasn't a young Spider-Man.
Yeah.
He's 8 years into his career. I'm like, this is genius.
Yeah. Which is what I've been wanting to see in the movies for a while, honestly. Like when they first implied they were going to bring Spider-Man into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, my first thought was, okay, let's ditch the origin. If you want to keep Andrew Garfield, fine, but he's been Spider-Man for like 8 years now, and you just haven't seen him because he's not with the Avengers. But we can easily just like insert little things where people are aware of him, and now here he is. Yeah, and I mean, they still did a great.
Yeah,
Spider-Man. I think Tom Holland is actually fantastic. I loved Spider-Man: Homecoming. Not a perfect movie, but I wasn't asking for that. It was way fun. It really got a lot of the heart of Peter Parker and his world. But yeah, there is an appeal of, especially with a character where some people seem to think the only interesting thing you can do with him is to keep him in high school. It's great to see. No, here is post-grad Peter Parker
working in the laboratory. He's no longer at the Daily Bugle. And the things they did were so good, like making J. Jonah Jameson not a newspaper salesman, and now he's running his own podcast, kind of like Bill O'Reilly or something.
He's basically like Glenn Beck or Bill O'Reilly or Sean Hannity. He's just like spewing all these conspiracy theories to get hits and just to be angry. It's a great modernization of things. I loved, again, they embraced the geek culture. So you've got all these different costumes for Spider-Man that have different abilities. I mean, that's because Spider-Man is in this sort of in between the Flash and Superman and in between Batman, where he does deal with a lot of street crime and what we might call more realistic crime, but is someone who will fully embrace and just shrug his shoulders at the weird sci-fi elements that can come in, whether that's a guy who has arms like an octopus, or he's being thrown into the negative zone, or he's being bounced around through time, or Ghost Rider's in trouble again. Like, Peter just sort of rolls with the punches, and so he's a great character where you can emphasize, yeah, you know what? In this game, you can pick up this costume that gives you sonic powers, and this costume where he's a punk rock star. Why? Because comics.
Yeah, but it's still great, you know what I mean? I think like what it comes down to is the successful superhero games have always been the games that are like the people behind them were like, we're fans of this character. We want to do justice for it. So let's, you know, do it this way. Let's add in those. Let's have Kevin Conroy come in and voice Batman. Let's have Mark Hamill do the Joker. Let's, you know, have Paul Dini write. Let's go in and let's have an aged up Peter Parker and like leave hints towards comic book storylines that we could do in the future, you know, and just Spider-Man is definitely like one of those games that people are going to remember for a long time. Like I got the statue behind me, but I love it. Love that game.
No, it's really great. And you're absolutely right. It's the same thing with film adaptations or TV adaptations. They don't have to have been a lifelong fan. I don't believe that. But if you're offering them a project, they need to delve into it and become a fan of both the product and why this has meant something to people. They have to really dig that.
100%.
Whereas, you know, unfortunately there are so many comic book movies where the director will flat out tell you, I don't really like superheroes, or I don't really like this person, but so this is my take on it. And 90% of the time, it ends up in something bad. Like when you have Trank coming on to direct Fantastic Four, and he tells you in an interview, yeah, I'm not really a fan of superhero comics. I'm approaching this as a Cronenberg film, like The Fly. I'm like, no, stop right there. It is literally called Fantastic Four. That title tells you, don't take it too seriously or take it into a dark place. This dude, Mr. Fantastic, read the comics. He makes a flying car called, wait for it, the Fantastic Car. He made a ship he called the Pogo Plane. That's the kind of world you're dealing with. Don't try to be like, because we wouldn't think to apply that to so many other things. People will apply that to comics, like, well, don't worry, he's not a comic book fan, so he'll give this a fresh new take. Like, but you're not bringing a director into Harry Potter who will say, you know what, honestly, I freaking hate magic. So in my version, Harry Potter gets corrective eye surgery, because why wouldn't he? And we're not going to use wands. And no, you wouldn't do that. Or like, you know, I'm happy to direct Star Wars, but the space magic, the Jedi wizards don't make sense. And also a laser can't become a sword. So we're going to give them real swords. No, you agreed that this is the world. This is the world you entered in. And you can reinterpret things. You can put a new spin on it. But if you truly don't dig it, if you don't appreciate the elements that have stood the test of time, not every Spider-Man story needs to be taken into account. But the idea that keeps being repeated, the themes that keep being repeated, the stuff that has resonated with fans, if you don't respect that and learn to love it in your own way, then you're going to be wasting your time.
Well, at the end of the day, there's a reason why these characters have been around for as many years as they have been, you know?
Yeah, and they're definitely open to adapt to new interpretation. If they couldn't, we would have stopped reading Spider-Man a while ago. Like Lee and Kirby, Lee and Ditko, if they kept writing him and drawing him like they did in 1963, yeah, at this point we would have been like, it would have been like the Peanuts, where we might be aware it's there. No one's really running to read the new Peanuts comic, you know? Like, or Mickey Mouse, where we like Mickey Mouse, but after a while he's sort of trapped in this bubble, and we might put out a special Mickey movie every 4 years, but that's kind of it. Like, it's not an ongoing saga that we're a part of. But Superman, Batman, Spider-Man are.
Okay, well, Alan, thanks for joining me.
Sure thing.
For this podcast. We went a little over, but for the last part of this podcast, I want us to pitch a game. Or, you know, pick a character, Marvel or DC. You want to go indie, you can go indie. But I want you to pick one superhero you'd like to see a game of.
I mean, the the obvious thing for me, for my love, and because they keep doing him wrong, I would say Superman. I would approach it as almost a Telltale type game, where a lot of it would be these scenes of sort of stealth investigation as Clark and Lois investigating certain situations and stuff. Or with Clark, certain writers like Grant Morrison did the great thing of that some of Clark's clumsiness is actually him secretly using his powers to like push people out of the way and stuff like that. I would find that a great challenge if you had to save people without it being obvious or something. And then couple that with maybe Superman's lost half his powers and he has to find like crystals from the fortress to slowly start recharging him, like until he can have all his arsenal at the end and like beat Brainiac or something. That would be my most obvious thing. So it'd be sort of a mix of Arkham Asylum and the Telltale stuff. Other than that, like if you want to go for someone who really hasn't been approached in games yet, I would love to see an RPG style, like maybe Mass Effect style game with some of the mystic characters of the DC universe, like Zatanna and Etrigan, or with Doctor Strange over at Marvel.
Alrighty, I would go Infamous. Oh,
Okay.
not Infamous. Invincible. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
I think
Invincible's a great saga.
Yeah, and I like how it has a definitive end. I haven't got to the end yet, but I've liked where I'm at so far. But I feel like it'd be much in the way of a Superman game. Kind of, you want to. It'd be kind of cool to hit that moment, you know, when you have the big invasion and you got to fight. That'd be pretty cool to do, but I don't know, just something I'd pitch.
Yeah,
kind of cool.
Absolutely.
Okay, Alan. Well, anything you got coming up that the guys watching or have got this far would like to know about?
It's been on hiatus for a bit, but I'm starting back up my column on geekgirlauthority.com, Nerdy Love Letters, which is basically me talking each entry about a story or idea or character that I love. And that might be like the character Dazzler from the X-Men. It might be the first episode of Murphy Brown. And we get into like what made this interesting, what made this speak to me, what do I think still applies to storytelling today. Future episodes will deal with things like the Pirates of Dark Water and certain characters from Shakespeare. It's just across storytelling. You can also find me on Twitter at sizzlerkistler.com, SIZZLERKISTLER. I shouldn't have said .com, it's Twitter. You can find archives of my work and updates of my new columns at alankistler.com, ALANKISTLER.com. And keep abreast there because there might be, I'm working on an audio drama podcast and hopefully we'll be able to announce something by New Year. So, yeah.
Cool. All right, guys. Well, I thank you so much for watching this long episode of Story Mode. But I had fun. I hope, Alan, you had fun.
I did.
Cool. That's all that matters. Well, guys, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you guys again next time. Bye. You can say bye, too.
Take care.
Bye.